Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And today's podcast continues our series looking at the Percy family and the Wars of the Roses.
In the last episode, we gave you a brief introduction to what happened with the members of the Percy family during those conflicts. But on today's episode, we're joined by His Grace the 12th Duke of Northumberland, who's published a new book, Lions of the Red Rose. The book explores the story of his ancestors in the 15th century, alongside brand new maps and illustrations created just for the book, as well as documents and objects from the castle collection and archives.
He will also be appearing at an event for Lions of the Red Rose at Alnwick Castle on the 25th of April, for which tickets are now available.
We were able to sit down with His Grace to talk a little bit about the research and the writing of the book and what inspired him to look into this part of his family's history. Here is that conversation. Please enjoy. We are very pleased to be joined on this episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast by the author of Lions of the Red Rose, His Grace the 12th Duke of Northumberland. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
That's a pleasure.
So I want to start by asking what inspired you to write a book about the Wars of the Roses.
Well, I had a very superficial understanding of this very complex period in British history and my family's involvement with it. They were one of the principal families in England at this time, recovering from disaster and disgrace after their rebellion against Henry IV, feuding with the Nevilles, protecting the English border from belligerent Scots, fighting in France under Henry V, leading the north on behalf of the House of Lancaster under the weak King Henry VI and his powerful Queen Margaret of Anjou, and fighting and dying in various battles against the Nevilles and the House of York in what came to be known as the Wars of the Roses. I wanted to find out more and discovered many books, essays and documents which COVID lockdown gave me time to research this interesting period. So unintentionally, this evolved into a book which gives a slightly different angle to the events of that period, viewed not from the royal families of Lancaster and York, but from the Percys of Northumberland.
Was it a subject you'd been familiar with beforehand?
Not really, funnily enough. This period is squeezed between two other family catastrophes. The Percy rebellion against Henry IV, as I already mentioned, and the Tudor period, which saw Percy family members disgraced, executed, murdered, all in the course of Catholicism, and titles and lands appropriated by the Crown. But this is a crucial, complicated and brutal period at the end of the Middle Ages that deserves far more attention than I had ever given it before.
Your first book, Lions of the North, covers the whole history of the family, including that Tudor period, the rebellion against Henry IV, and everything both before and after it. How different did it feel writing about a more condensed time period? We're talking about no more than half a century in Lions of the Red Rose.
Well, the latter was an overview of my family's history, describing the main characters and events over nearly 1,000 years since the Norman conquest. This new book, Lions of the Red Rose, delves much deeper into the Percys during the 15th century. And I really enjoyed the contrast, I think. I think I gained a greater understanding of life and death in that period, and so many other things like the advances in warfare, the role of religion, the evolution of bastard feudalism, European politics, and the overwhelming importance of strong leadership.
We meet the Lions of the Red Rose throughout the book. One of my favourites is Thomas, Lord Egremont, who seems to have inherited the temper of his grandfather Hotspur. What were they like, these members of the Percy family? Were they all warriors in the Hotspur mould?
I think, Daniel, it was hard not to be a warrior during this period. The Percys were, at one time or another, at war with the Scots, the French, their neighbours, their cousins, and, of course, the monarch. After the second Earl of Northumberland was savagely killed by the order of Yorkist leaders during the first minor conflict of the Wars of the Roses at St Albans, His 4 warrior sons all swore vengeance and died in subsequent battles against the Yorkists. His grandson, the 4th Earl, fought the Scots with Richard of Gloucester, later Richard III, and his failure to engage his troops at Bosworth on behalf of the king certainly contributed to Richard's death and defeat. The Earl's apparent support for Henry VII and resulting restoration of all titles and estates did not save him from a violent death at the hands of a Yorkshire mob in 1489. But of course not all family members could be warriors, and 2 of the 2nd Earl's sons went into the church, one becoming Bishop of Carlisle, where he plotted with his brother Thomas, your friend, to undermine the Nevilles.
Yeah, I don't know whether we'd have got on as friends, Egremont and I.
I suspect not.
No. So you mentioned that they were fighting, among other people, the armies of Scotland. How did border conflict with Scotland affect the events of the Wars of the Roses that a lot of people think of as traditionally English?
I think the border was rarely peaceful at this stage, and the Scots were regularly raiding well into northern England, taking advantage of English armies weakened by events further south. During all this period, pacts were made between the Scots and one or other of the English factions in the hope of acquiring territorial gains. And when the Civil War moved into the border region after the Battle of Towton of 1461, Henry VI's Queen, Margaret of Anjou, made peace with the Scots, promised to give them Berwick and Roxburgh Castle, offered her son's hand of marriage to the Scottish king's sister, and employed an army of Scottish mercenaries to march south against the new Yorkist king, Edward IV. As she didn't have the money to pay them, she let them loose to rape, rob, kill, and terrorise the English population. And this, of course, ultimately strengthened her Yorkist opponents as the terrified English flocked to Edward IV's banner.
As we go down from Scotland and the border into the north, there was a huge rivalry between the Percy family and the Neville family in the north during this time. How important was that rivalry, and did it impact the wider war?
After Hotspur's rebellion in 1403 and his father, the first Earl's revolt in 1405 and death in 1408, the Percys lost most of their titles and lands. The Nevilles, already large Yorkshire landowners, greatly benefited from the Percy disgrace, filling the power void and acquiring some of the Percy lands. So although the Percys were reinstated by Henry V in 1416, when Hotspur's son was made 2nd Earl of Northumberland, the Nevilles held considerable wealth, power and influence, along with an expanding empire, and this really galled the Percys. Both the Earl of Salisbury, head of the main Neville branch, and the Earl of Northumberland had violent, hot-headed sons, whose quarrels evolved into a vicious and ultimately violent feud. A brief battle at Stamford Bridge ended badly for the Percy brothers, 2 of whom, Thomas and Richard, ended up in Newgate prison. An all-out conflict in Yorkshire involving the 2 earls was only narrowly avoided, but the feud, along with similar disagreements between other nobles, helped to polarise the English aristocracy into factions, both sides seeking powerful allies, and they could all at this time muster considerable armies of retainers, thanks to bastard feudalism. Henry VI tried, but was too weak to stop this dangerous belligerence from sliding into civil war. So the Percys and the Nevilles must take considerable responsibility, really, for the events that followed over the next 30 years.
And this is all covered in Lions of the Red Rose. Did you find any particularly interesting events or people to research or write about? Did you find out anything new about these Percy family members during the time?
I think there are many fascinating characters, and I think our understanding of them is slightly marred by Shakespearean fiction. But of the many, I think Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf who, in her quest to protect her weak husband and young son, and caused the death of many thousands, dying alone and sick in a French nunnery, having lost her son, her husband, and her throne. I think she's one of the sort of critical characters of the time. along with the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, who was another fascinating Machiavellian character, whose ruthless disregard for chivalry led to the brutal deaths of the Duke of Somerset, the Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford at St Albans, and whose political machinations ultimately led to his own brutal demise at the hands of his previous protégé, King Edward IV, at Barnet. And Richard, Duke of York, probably the ablest administrator and commander of the age, but his arrogance and his arrogant attempt to have himself crowned king repelled even his strongest allies, Warwick and Salisbury. Then Edward IV was probably the pivotal character of the time. He showed so much promise as a young warrior, but became a lazy, dissolute, overweight and debauched king. And of course this list cannot be complete without his brother, Richard III, the ruthless uncle to the rightful King Edward V. And according to your views, he was a vicious murderer or a misunderstood hero who fell valiantly in battle to Henry Tudor. But this book focuses on the Percys, and they had heroes and villains too. The chivalrous second Earl, for instance, was saved from capture by the Scots by the bravery of his eldest son, Lord Poynings, who gave his horse to his father as the enemy approached, and was captured as a result. Poynings became the third Earl, who led the vanguard at Towton, and died in the snow and mud of that dreadful battle. His brother Thomas, Lord Egremont, was a violent and bad-natured warrior who exacerbated the Percy-Neville feud with his vendetta against Sir John Neville in particular. And he was sent to Newgate Prison after the Battle of Stamford Bridge with his younger brother Richard, and they made a daring escape to join the Lancastrian forces before being hacked to death outside the king's tent, protecting the monarch at the Battle of Northampton. That was Thomas, not Richard. Richard died at Towton. And then there is my namesake, Sir Ralph Percy, the last of the four brothers, who died bravely, outnumbered and fighting to the last at the Battle of Hedgeley Moor in Northumberland, deserted by other Lancastrian leaders.
Did writing the book change how you viewed the 15th century and this fight for the throne, or did it more reinforce what a violent and what a struggle of a time it was to be alive and to be in these sorts of positions?
Yes, I think it certainly helped me to understand how circumstances, weak kingship, overpowerful barons with their own armies, and very poor leadership in France in particular, leading to the loss of all French lands except Calais, took this highly respected England of Henry V to a debased and sickly country by the middle of Henry VI's reign, a few decades afterwards. I think it is a fascinating period because it is the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era, when changes throughout Europe, throughout the world, were actually dictating politics in a much more sensitive and effective way.
And in the book, some of those wider changes are touched on. We see what's happening elsewhere in the world as these events are going on. People like Da Vinci are coming up, Machu Picchu is being built in South America, and it really gives a context for the whole world at this time. And what would you like readers to take away once they've read Lines of the Red Rose?
I found this period pretty hard to understand. You'd have to look at it with fresh eyes, I think, and not be marred by the sort of Shakespearean fiction. I find it really interesting, and what I've tried to do is simplify it. So I hope that I've made it a little clearer to others. I think that'll be, I will have achieved something if that happens.
Yes. And the book will be available here at Alnwick Castle from 2024, as well as a brand new exhibition, also called Lines of the Red Rose. So with that, thank you very much, Your Grace, for joining us on the Alnwick Castle podcast.
That's a complete pleasure. Thank you very much.
Lines of the Red Rose has been designed, printed and published in the North East and is now available to buy from Alnwick Castle's gift shops. The book is accompanied by a new exhibition which you can see during your Alnwick Castle visit. You'll hear more about the exhibition in a future episode of the podcast. Tickets for the Lines of the Red Rose event on the 25th of April are available now from the Alnwick Castle website.
If you enjoyed the episode, don't just buy the book, head back into our podcast feed for the previous episode, which gives you a brief introduction to this period in Percy family history. Give the podcast a share, please add a rating on your podcast platform and let us know what you thought. You can email us on podcast@alnwickcastle.com.
We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with a preview of our Easter 2024 activities when we speak to professional jester Tom Fool. Until then, I've been Deborah.
And I've been Daniel.
Thank you very much for listening and goodbye.
Bye.